There's a specific transition almost nobody registers while it's actually happening. The exact moment an empath stops explaining themselves and simply goes quiet instead. It doesn't look dramatic. There's no slammed door, no raised voice, no final ultimatum delivered with tears or anger, just silence, arriving so quietly that most people don't even notice the shift has occurred until weeks later. Looking back, trying to identify exactly when everything started feeling different. Today, we're talking about that specific silence, what it actually means when it arrives, and what happens afterward that almost nobody sees coming. Let's start with something crucial to understand before anything else. This particular silence is not the same as ordinary withdrawal, sulking, or someone simply needing space during a rough patch. Those forms of quiet tend to have an expiration date built in, an implicit sense that normal communication will eventually resume once whatever triggered the withdrawal has passed. The silence we're discussing today is different in kind, not just degree. It arrives after years, sometimes decades, of the opposite behavior. Constant explanation, constant effort to be understood, constant willingness to put words to feelings in the hope that clarity would finally produce change. This particular silence shows up specifically once that entire strategy has been exhausted, tested repeatedly, and found, conclusively, not to work. Here's the first thing worth understanding about why this silence is so different from anything that preceded it. It isn't emotional in the way people expect. Most people assume silence, when it finally arrives after years of trying to communicate, must be angry, must be a form of punishment, must carry some charge of resentment underneath its quiet surface. But the specific silence we're describing tends to be something closer to administrative than emotional. Not, "I'm too upset to talk to you," but "I've run the experiment enough times to know the outcome, and I no longer see the point in running it again." This distinction matters enormously because it explains why this silence, once it arrives, tends to be so much more stable and so much harder to break through than any angry temporary withdrawal ever was. Let's talk about what actually precedes this moment, because the silence never arrives out of nowhere, even though it often looks that way to whoever's on the receiving end. For years, an empath in this position has typically tried nearly everything available to them. Gentle explanation, direct confrontation, written letters when spoken words didn't land, patient repetition of the same concern across multiple conversations, hoping that saying it differently, or saying it again, might finally produce the understanding that eluded every previous attempt. Each of these attempts required real vulnerability, real hope that this specific effort might be the one that finally worked. And each failed attempt, accumulated over enough time, teaches something the empath eventually internalizes completely. More words are not going to solve this. The problem was never a communication failure. It was a willingness failure, and no amount of additional explanation can manufacture willingness that was never actually there. This is the actual origin of the silence, and understanding it changes how you interpret everything that follows. It isn't withdrawal born from giving up on the relationship emotionally. It's withdrawal born from finally, completely accepting a conclusion that had actually been available much earlier. But that took this long to fully absorb, because absorbing it required releasing hope that had been, until this point, actively, deliberately sustained. Let's talk about what actually happens once this specific silence sets in, because it unfolds in a fairly predictable sequence, even though almost nobody on the receiving end recognizes the pattern while it's actually occurring. The first thing that happens, an initial period where the silence gets misread entirely, interpreted as something temporary, something that will resolve on its own timeline, the way previous quiet periods always eventually did. This misreading is understandable because it's based on real, accurate pattern recognition from the relationship's earlier history. Every previous silence did eventually end. Every previous withdrawal did eventually resolve back into the familiar rhythm of explanation and effort. What isn't recognized in this initial period is that the pattern has actually fundamentally changed, and applying the old expectation to this new, different silence produces a specific kind of confusion that tends to persist for weeks or even months before the actual difference becomes undeniable. The second thing that happens, once the initial misreading starts to break down, an escalating series of attempts to reopen the old channel, using exactly the tactics that used to reliably restore communication. Increased contact, increased apparent concern, sometimes genuine attempts at the kind of vulnerability or accountability that might have worked earlier in the relationship, before this specific threshold had been crossed. This escalation reveals something important about how significant the silence actually is, because the intensity of the response to it tends to be directly proportional to how much the previous, constant explanation and effort had actually been relied upon, whether that reliance was ever consciously acknowledged before its absence became so noticeable. The third thing that happens, and this is where the actual shock referenced in this episode's title tends to land hardest, the realization that this particular silence isn't actually about anger, isn't a bid for attention, isn't a negotiating tactic waiting to be met with the right response. It's simply, genuinely, a completed process. Someone who has already done all their internal work, already reached their own private, settled conclusion, and who is no longer engaged in an active negotiation about the relationship's future at all. This realization tends to be genuinely disorienting for whoever's on the receiving end, because it requires confronting something that runs against every previous pattern in the relationship. That this specific silence isn't a communication waiting for the right response. It's the absence of any remaining communication left to have. I want to talk about why this specific dynamic, silence following exhausted explanation, produces such a different outcome than the more familiar patterns of conflict we usually discuss in relationships. Most conflict, even serious conflict, involves an ongoing negotiation where both people are still, in some sense, trying to influence the other's position, still hoping to produce movement, still treating the relationship's outcome as something actively contested and potentially changeable. The silence we're describing today represents the end of that negotiation, not a new tactic within it. This is precisely why it tends to be so much harder to reverse than any previous conflict in the relationship's history. Not because the empath going silent is being deliberately stubborn or punitive, but because there's genuinely nothing left from their side that they're still trying to accomplish through continued engagement. I want to say something important about why this particular silence, once it genuinely sets in, tends to be accompanied by a strange, almost unsettling calm on the empath's part, rather than the visible distress that might be expected. This calm often gets misread as coldness, or as evidence that the relationship never actually mattered as much as it seemed to. What it actually reflects is something closer to completion. The internal work of reaching this conclusion happened gradually, privately, over a long period, which means by the time the silence becomes externally visible, the empath has already processed the bulk of whatever grief or difficulty was involved in reaching it. The silence isn't the beginning of their emotional process, it's frequently much closer to the end of it. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What actually happens in the weeks and months after this silence fully settles in, why the specific thing that happens next surprises almost everyone who witnesses it, and why understanding this entire mechanism in advance changes how you should interpret this particular kind of quiet, whenever and wherever you encounter it, for the rest of your life. Let's talk about what actually happens in the weeks and months after this silence fully settles in, because this is where the story diverges sharply from what most people expect, and understanding this divergence is the entire point of this episode's title. Here's what most people, whoever's on the receiving end of this silence, tend to expect will happen next. Continued distress, continued visible struggle, some eventual crack in the silence where the empath reaches back out, either because they missed the relationship too much to maintain the distance, or because guilt or loneliness eventually wins out over whatever resolve produced the silence in the first place. This expectation makes intuitive sense, because it's based on how most people experience conflict and distance, as something uncomfortable enough that eventually someone breaks first, someone reaches back, The tension resolves one way or another because sustained, unresolved silence feels, to most people, genuinely unbearable to maintain indefinitely. What actually happens in case after case is something almost nobody predicts. The silence doesn't crack. It deepens into something calmer, more settled, and considerably more permanent than the initial withdrawal suggested it would become. And underneath that deepening silence, something else entirely starts happening. Something that constitutes the actual shock referenced in this episode's title, the empath, rather than struggling visibly with the absence of the relationship, begins building something new in the space that silence has created. Let's talk about what this building actually looks like, because it tends to follow a recognizable pattern. The first thing that tends to happen, an almost immediate redirection of the enormous amount of mental and emotional energy that used to be spent on constant explanation toward literally anything else. Remember, we established in the first half that this silence arrives after years of active, ongoing effort to communicate, to be understood, to produce change through words. That effort, once released, doesn't simply disappear. It gets redirected, often with startling speed, into whatever the empath has been neglecting during all those years of trying to fix a relationship that was never actually going to change through additional explanation. This might look like sudden, renewed focus on work, on creative projects, on physical health, on friendships that had been quietly starved during the years of concentrated effort spent on the relationship that's now gone silent. The second thing that tends to happen, a genuine, often visible increase in the empath's overall emotional stability, precisely during the period when everyone watching expects to see distress. This is one of the more counterintuitive aspects of this entire pattern, and it confuses people who are still operating under the assumption that silence must indicate suppressed pain waiting to surface. What's actually happening is closer to relief, though relief is often too simple a word for something more complex. The release of a burden that had been carried for years, the burden of feeling responsible for continuously trying to produce understanding or change in someone who had already demonstrated repeatedly that they weren't going to provide it. Once that burden is set down, the emotional energy previously consumed by carrying it becomes available again, producing a kind of stability that looks, to outside observers, almost suspiciously calm given what's supposedly just been lost. The third thing that tends to happen, and this is often the piece that produces genuine shock in whoever's still trying to reach the silent empath, the silence stops being oriented toward them at all. In the initial weeks, the silence still has, in some sense, the other person as its reference point, quiet specifically in relation to them, quiet as the absence of something that used to be directed at them. Over time, this orientation shifts. The silence stops being about the relationship's absence and starts simply being the natural quiet of someone whose attention has genuinely, fully moved elsewhere. This shift is subtle but significant, because it means any eventual attempt to reopen communication isn't met with residual hurt or residual hope. It's met with something closer to genuine indifference, not cruel, not performed, simply accurate, the indifference of someone who has actually completely moved their attention somewhere else. I want to talk about why this pattern, silence deepening into stability and redirection, rather than cracking into reconnection, happens so much more consistently than most people expect, because understanding the mechanism matters as much as understanding the pattern itself. The core reason is something we established in the first half. This silence arrives only after the internal work of reaching a settled conclusion has already largely occurred. It isn't the beginning of a grieving process that might eventually resolve toward reconciliation. It's much closer to the end of one, arriving externally only once the internal process has essentially finished. This means the silence has none of the instability that characterizes genuinely unresolved conflict, where both people are still actively negotiating, still genuinely uncertain how things will resolve. There's no genuine uncertainty left on the empath's side by the time this particular silence becomes visible, which is exactly why it holds so much more consistently than anyone watching from outside typically expects. I want to talk about what this means, Practically, for anyone who recognizes themselves as the person currently on the receiving end of this exact kind of silence, watching someone they care about go quiet in a way that feels different from anything that's happened before in the relationship. The most useful thing you can actually understand, based on everything we've discussed today, is this. The window for the kind of engagement that used to work, more explanation, more apology, more promises of change, has very likely already closed, not because the empath is being cruel or punitive, but because that specific kind of engagement was tested repeatedly over years and found conclusively insufficient. Continuing to offer more of exactly what's already been tried and already failed tends to accomplish very little, regardless of how sincerely it's offered this time. What might actually matter, if anything does, is something categorically different from more words: sustained, demonstrated, unglamorous behavioral change, maintained consistently over a genuinely extended period, without any expectation of immediate acknowledgement or immediate reopening of the relationship in response. This is a much higher bar than most people are actually willing to meet, which is precisely why this specific silence, once it settles in, so rarely gets successfully reversed. But it is, at least theoretically, the only category of response that addresses what actually produced the silence in the first place, rather than simply repeating the same category of effort that already, definitively, proved insufficient. I want to close this out with something important about why this entire pattern matters for how you understand silence going forward, in any relationship, for the rest of your life. Not all silence means what we've described today. Ordinary withdrawal, temporary need for space, quiet born from a single difficult moment rather than years of accumulated, exhausted effort. None of this carries the same weight or the same likely trajectory. What we've described today is specific, silence that arrives only after years of genuine, repeated attempts at explanation, silence that carries a particular calm rather than visible distress, silence that deepens rather than cracks over time. Learning to recognize this specific signature, distinct from ordinary conflict or temporary distance, is one of the most useful pieces of relational understanding available, because it tells you, with remarkable reliability, exactly how much room actually remains for change, and exactly how that room, once genuinely closed, tends to stay that way. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures everything we've walked through across both halves of this episode. Picture a well that's been drawn from constantly for years by someone standing at its edge, calling down into the water again and again, certain that if they simply called clearly enough, loudly enough, with the right words finally arranged in the right order, something would eventually answer back the way they'd always hoped it would. And for years, this calling continues. Variations tried, tones adjusted, patience extended far longer than most people would have sustained it, because the person calling genuinely believed for a very long time that the right combination of words was still somewhere out there, waiting to be found. And then, one day, without any dramatic final shout, without any door slammed in frustration, the calling simply stops. Not because the well ran dry in some tragic final sense, because the person standing at its edge finally, quietly, understood something that had actually been true for a very long time. Nothing was ever going to answer back. Not because the well was broken, but because it was never actually capable of answering questions shouted down into it in the first place. The problem was never really about finding the right words. It was about the fundamental nature of what was actually being asked of something that was never designed to respond. Here is what happens next, in almost every version of this story. The person who finally stops calling doesn't collapse beside the well in permanent grief over the silence. They turn, eventually, and walk toward an entire landscape that's been waiting there the whole time, unexplored, because every ounce of their attention had been fixed on that one specific well for so many years running. And what they find once they actually start walking tends to surprise even them. Rivers they'd never noticed, running clear and full nearby, entire sources of water that had been available the whole time, simply overlooked because their eyes had never once left the one well they'd convinced themselves was the only source worth calling toward. The silence in the end was never actually the tragedy everyone standing nearby assumed it would be. It was simply, finally, the moment someone stopped calling into something that was never going to answer and started walking, instead, toward everything that actually could.